Opening the door for queenside development, this knight leap immediately fights for central influence and prepares for queenside expansion. Opening a flank aggressively, black immediately challenges white's central control and sets up a potentially unbalanced game, sacrificing pawn structure for initiative. Securing the dark-squared bishop's diagonal and preparing kingside fianchetto creates potential pressure on black's exposed queenside. Developing a knight centrally fortifies the pawn structure and eyes white's kingside intentions. Solidifying the fianchetto, this bishop eyes the long diagonal, creating strategic pressure and a solid defensive structure for the kingside. Solidifying the center and preparing for further pawn advances creates a flexible pawn structure. Asserting central control with d4 immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens lines for piece activity, aiming for a dynamic advantage. Securing the king's Indian setup with a fianchetto, although it concedes significant central space and potentially weakens the queenside. Securely tucking the king away opens up the possibilities for central pawn pushes and piece development. Developing the bishop to this diagonal solidifies black's fianchetto structure, preparing to challenge white's central control. Expanding the central pawn chain, white immediately stakes a claim on important squares, preparing to contest control of the d5 outpost and potentially launch an attack down the semi-open c-file. Bringing the king to safety, black reinforces the natural development and prepares for the upcoming central struggles, demonstrating a sensible prioritization of king security over immediate pawn advances. Reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for central expansion, this knight repositioning aims to bolster the e4 square while subtly eyeing black's queenside ambitions, promising a complex strategic battle ahead. A curious repositioning, Key 8 seems to shy away from the e-file's potential influence and perhaps aims to support a future pawn push like e5, though it does concede central space and delays development of the queenside. Asserting central dominance, this pawn push immediately seizes valuable territory, restricting black's knight mobility and preparing a potential kingside assault by forcing their pieces to less active squares. Unleashing the knight to a6, black strategically aims to reposition this piece, potentially targeting the queenside or supporting a pawn push on the b-file, while simultaneously avoiding the central cramping white's central pawn push has imposed, thereby seeking counterplay outside the immediate storm. Initiating a queenside advance, this rook placement aims to seize open lines and potentially threaten pawn pushes like b4, aiming to disrupt black's king's safety and create new attacking avenues while solidifying white's central control. Developing the bishop to its diagonal after castling completes black's initial setup, aiming to challenge white's queenside pressure and prepare for potential e5 advances. Expanding on the queenside asserts white's territorial ambitions, aiming to pry open lines for potential breakthroughs and limit black's counterplay. Breaking the queenside pawn chain creates immediate dynamic tension, forcing a reevaluation of piece placement and potential pawn breaks. Initiating this pawn exchange decisively opens the d-file for potential rook activity, creating an immediate pressure point against black's somewhat exposed king. A strategic repositioning, reclaiming the pawn that was sacrificed to disrupt black's pawn structure, simultaneously activating the bishop to a more central diagonal and contesting the now open c-file, though it does concede some queenside space for white's rook. Activating the queen to pressure the d6 pawn and eye the weakened kingside, this move simultaneously prepares for potential pawn breaks and asserts a stronger presence in the center, forcing black to react to this immediate threat and consider their own development. Instigating a direct confrontation in the center with e4, black challenges white's control and prepares to exploit the d5 pawn's isolation, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack. Emboldening the queenside pawn structure by committing the bishop to this diagonal prepares a potential breakthrough on the b-file while also providing crucial support for the knights. A bold maneuver, black surrenders the bishop pair, but in exchange aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and activate the knight on a central square, potentially creating an outpost. This exchange sacrifices a key positional asset for dynamic attacking possibilities. The bishop's recapture on c3 seizes control of that central diagonal, creating a dynamic imbalance and setting the stage for further pawn pushes or piece activity on the queen side. Executing this bishop exchange on c3 simplifies black's position, but it also relinquishes the dark-squared bishop, which could have been a valuable defender of the kingside and a long-range attacker on the a1h8 diagonal. The immediate consequence is a more open center, which white can now exploit with their pieces, particularly the rook on b1 and the queen on b3, eyeing the weakened squares. Black must now be mindful of potential pawn breaks and tactical thrusts from white as the game progresses into a more fluid middle game. Suddenly, the queenside tension explodes as white ignites a pawn storm, aiming to disrupt black's solid structure and pry open lines against the vulnerable king. Instead of reinforcing the pawn chain and accepting the structural imbalance, black opts to initiate a pawn break, aiming to dislodge white's central control and open lines for counterplay. Suddenly, the white queen claims its territory on the c3 square, a bold maneuver that aims to disrupt black's pawn chain and open lines for attack. Black is now facing an immediate decision about the exposed pawn on c5. Allowing it to stand might solidify white's queenside pressure, but capturing it opens up the d-file for white's rook and potentially creates weaknesses around black's king. This pawn thrust forcefully penetrates black's position, creating a dynamic imbalance and aiming to exploit the weakened queenside structure that resulted from the exchange on c5. Snatching that bishop opens a vital diagonal for your queen, but leaves your own king surprisingly exposed to a direct assault across the center. A sharp repositioning, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create tactical opportunities on the kingside while simultaneously contesting the open files. 18, rb8. The rook's repositioning now challenges the weakened b5 square, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and exploit the open b-file that might soon develop. Reactivating the central pressure by bringing the rook to the center, this maneuver simultaneously prepares to contest the vital e-file and offers potential support for a future advance along the third rank, aiming to exploit the exposed white squares around black's king. Fortifying the queenside pawn chain becomes paramount after the open c-file, aiming to create a stable defensive structure against white's potential kingside aggression. Introducing an e4 pawn establishes a crucial central outpost, immediately contesting black's queenside pawn mass and creating potential attacking avenues. This pawn advance is a double-edged sword. While it broadens white's central control and prepares for further pawn pushes, it also exposes the e4 square and could become a target if not adequately supported. The strategic intent here is to disrupt black's pawn structure and initiate a more dynamic phase of the game, aiming to exploit any weaknesses that arise from black's potentially overextended queenside. Consider the implications for pawn chains. White's new e4 pawn, combined with d5, forms a robust central phalanx that restricts black's pieces and limits their maneuverability. This move sets the stage for a potential clash in the center, forcing black to react and potentially deviate from their existing plans, which might involve castling or developing their queenside. The geometry of the board shifts. The e4 pawn opens lines for white's bishops and potentially creates attacking opportunities on the kingside if black's king remains there. This ambitious pawn push signals white's desire to seize the initiative and put pressure on black's position, aiming for active play rather than passive defense. Embracing the initiative on the queenside with the knight's advance to c7 strategically bolsters the defense of black's kingside pawn structure, a critical defensive maneuver given white's aggressive central push and the open nature of the position. Unlocking the d-file potential and creating immediate pressure on black's king's defenses. The pawn sacrifice on f5 is a bold decision, aiming to shatter black's kingside pawn structure and disrupt the coordination of their pieces. White is clearly prioritizing initiative and piece activity over material. This move opens lines for the rooks and queen, and importantly, aims to exploit the vulnerability of black's king, which is still somewhat exposed after castling. The pawn on e4 is no longer a defensive barrier, and the subsequent exchange on f5 will likely lead to sharper play. The goal is to exploit the created weaknesses before black can consolidate and reorganize their forces. Consider how this advance will influence the control of the center and the open lines that will inevitably arise. Opening the king's diagonal, this capture initiates a complex interaction where black desperately seeks to exploit the exposed central pawns and establish counterplay, even at the cost of momentarily weakening their own monarch's defenses. Reclaiming the central square and preparing to activate the queen, this move aims to disrupt black's pawn chain and exert pressure on the queen side. Unlocking the queen side requires immediate attention, as the pawn structure now offers a clear target for the opponent's bishop on b2 to exploit. Unleashing a potent discovered attack, white's queen vacates its post, forcing the black king into immediate peril and threatening a decisive checkmate sequence that black must address with utmost urgency. The king retreats to safety, a sensible precaution against that suddenly active queen and bishop battery bearing down on the castled position. Reinforcing the central control and preparing for eventual pawn pushes, this rook maneuver now pins down the d-file, a crucial corridor that might soon witness decisive action given the exposed nature of black's monarch. The rook abandons its post on the c-file, a curious repositioning that seems to neglect the open lines and potential for counterplay on the queen side. Perhaps the intention is to bring this piece into the central fray, but the current development leaves the kingside defenses somewhat exposed to the advancing white pawns. This could lead to a rather passive position for black if white can successfully consolidate their central pawn presence and coordinate their pieces. Reinforcing the central pawn structure, this maneuver subtly reinforces white's attacking potential while simultaneously challenging black's king safety by offering a potential queen infiltration route. Seeking to redeploy the queen from its exposed forward position, black aims to connect the rooks and potentially reinforce the kingside. But this maneuver also cedes initiative and allows white to consolidate their growing space advantage. Unlocking the c-file's potential, white bravely sacrifices the bishop to expose the enemy monarch and create significant pressure along the open column, aiming to dismantle black's pawn shield. Challenging the central control with this aggressive rook maneuver, black aims to disrupt white's established pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the enemy king. The knight's sacrifice shatters the pawn chain and rips open lines towards black's king, creating immediate tactical opportunities that outweigh the material deficit. Sacrificing the bishop to dislodge the knight opens up the g-file, but simultaneously exposes the king to potential discovered attacks and creates weak squares around it, a dangerous gamble for black. The knight's sacrifice opens a deadly diagonal for the queen and aims to sever the pawn chain's defense of the black king. Seeking refuge for the bishop, black endeavors to untangle the knight and prepare for potential counterplay, but this maneuver leaves the queen side somewhat exposed and might concede crucial tempo. Opening the path for the queen and rook to engage the enemy king's defenses, this knight maneuver prepares a potent assault on black's now exposed monarch. The rook tucks away, attempting to solidify its position on the queen side and prepare for a potential counterplay down the c-file, but it leaves the king exposed to white's lurking pieces. Unleashing a powerful rook sacrifice to shatter black's queenside pawn structure and seize control of the open c-file, creating immediate attacking possibilities for white's remaining pieces. A bold attempt to consolidate the queen's position, but it leaves the king exposed to a potential avalanche of attackers. This bold rook sacrifice carves open a decisive assault, leveraging the bishop's control over the a7-g1 diagonal to isolate the enemy monarch and prepare for a swift mating attack that now seems inevitable given the exposed position. Attempting to redeploy the bishop to a more active square, though the surrounding pieces currently offer little support, hints at a desire to disrupt white's advancing pawns. Repositioning the rook to attack the now unguarded third rank creates immediate pressure on black's queenside, aiming to pry open the position further. Finally, a glimmer of activity for black's beleaguered knight, seeking to re-establish a foothold in white's territory and potentially disrupt the centralized queen. unleashing a powerful queen to menace the enemy king's safety, forcing a difficult decision. A bold gambit to trade queens now, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure and open lines for attack after your king escapes the immediate pressure. A daring knight sacrifice, plunging into the enemy camp and exposing the black king to a swift and brutal mating attack. The black king, now exposed and adrift in the center, finds itself under immediate and severe pressure, a direct consequence of the earlier pawn sacrifice and the aggressive placement of the white knight, which is now poised to deliver a devastating checkmate. The rook sacrifice on g4 has suddenly opened a critical pathway for white's knight, allowing it to dominate the center and create immediate threats against the exposed black king. The bishop's return to b5 aims to escape the pawn chain and perhaps regroup, but it leaves the e7 pawn potentially weak and surrenders some central influence. Seizing the initiative on the queen side, white aims to dislodge the black knight from its advanced post and prevent any potential counterplay, forcing a concrete decision. Sacrificing the bishop, black aims to disrupt white's centralized pieces and potentially create counterplay. But this opens up lines that could easily be exploited by the exposed king if white manages to coordinate their forces effectively. Recapturing the pawn, white initiates a decisive sequence, exploiting the open file and the pinned knight on d5 to begin simplifying into a winning endgame where the material advantage will prove overwhelming. Unleashing a positional surprise, black reacquaints the bishop with the open diagonals, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated rooks and potentially exploit the weakened queenside pawn structure that arose from the earlier exchange. The rook abandons its defensive post on the 8th rank, venturing into enemy territory to threaten the undefended bishop on c6. Initiating a desperate pawn thrust on the queenside after a prolonged tactical skirmish, aiming to disrupt white's newly coordinated pieces and potentially create counterplay. The rook's daring repositioning to d6 aims to exploit the exposed black king and create mating threats, a testament to the power of active piece play in a complex middle game. This maneuver to activate the knight on the queen side, despite its current isolation, hints at a desire to contest the d-file and potentially disrupt white's connected passed pawn. The rook's repositioning to the b-file sets a powerful snare for the isolated knight, threatening a swift liquidation of black's defenses and potentially opening lines towards the king. The knights leap back to see two bravely attempts to reroute into the queenside, hoping to offer support against the looming d-pawn or perhaps seek out new attacking possibilities on the queenside's weakened structure. Clearing the path for the rook to become more active on the reopened queenside, this repositioning aims to exploit the currently uncoordinated black pieces and potentially launch an attack down the 7th rank or support a passed pawn advance.